Talking about history is like peeling layers off an onion. It's not always as simple as it seems, especially when we're trying to understand the events of the Atlantic slave trade. This topic brings up two main points of view, one saying that African tribes sold their own people for money, and the other pointing out that Africans were sold into slavery. But hold on, it's not as black and white as it seems. To really grasp what was going on, we need to go back in time and look at things from the perspective of people living in those days. You see, the idea of black people didn't really exist back then like it does today. People in Africa identify themselves by their ethnic groups, languages, and traditions. The whole concept of being black wasn't a thing back then. Africans were indeed sold by Africans, and talking about women specifically, yes, women were indeed part of this tragic history. It's an important aspect that often gets overlooked. Some African societies did play a role in the sale of women as slaves, but before we jump to conclusions, let's understand the context. Women were unfortunately caught in the midst of power struggles, conflicts, and rivalries among different African communities. Back then, Africa was made up of diverse ethnic groups, each with their own cultures and languages. When conflicts arose, some tribes would capture individuals, including women from rival tribes, and sell them as slaves. It wasn't about selling your own people, it was about the complexities of intertribal dynamics. But here's the thing though, this wasn't the norm for all African societies. In fact, most people who were enslaved were captured during intertribal conflicts and raids where the captives were taken as spoils of war. These raids were driven by various factors such as power struggles, economic interest, and sometimes sheer greed. It wasn't about one group betraying the other, it was the result of a complicated web of circumstances. Now let's talk about women in particular. Many women ended up as slaves due to these raids and conflicts. They faced unimaginable challenges and hardships, torn away from their families and communities. This wasn't a matter of choice for them. It was the cruel reality of a time when might often determined right. These women endured suffering that's difficult for us to fully comprehend today. And just because they were sold as slaves to other tribes, it was easier for them to be sold by those tribe leaders to the Americans who came to enslave blacks. To make it easier to understand, if a woman from a rival tribe was enslaved by another African clan, they would make sure these women were sold to the Americans instead of their own. And this is exactly how the slave trade developed a new term, black selling blacks. However, we must remember that this isn't an indictment of all African societies. We can't generalize the actions of a few to represent an entire continent. The history of Africa is diverse, filled with a range of experiences, both positive and tragic. It's essential to recognize that many African societies were also victims of colonization, exploitation, and forced labor themselves. So what's the bottom line here? History is complicated. We can't judge the past through the lens of present-day perspectives. The Atlantic slave trade was a devastating chapter in human history marked by complex interactions, cultural clashes, and power struggles. Simplifying it to black selling blacks or Africans sold us doesn't do justice to the true story. As we reflect on this history, let's remember the countless lives that were affected, men, women, and children who endured unimaginable pain. Let's honor their memories by seeking a deeper understanding of the complexities that shaped this dark era. In conclusion, the events of the Atlantic slave trade are a lot more intricate than we might think. Simplistic narratives fail to capture the complexities of African societies and the historical context they were in. Women were unfortunately caught in the crossfire of conflicts and power struggles, leading to their enslavement. Let's approach history with an open mind, acknowledging the nuances and seeking to learn from the mistakes of the past.